Imagine the cold, unyielding pressure of a gun barrel pressed hard against the base of your spine. You can feel the distinct, unforgiving shape of the muzzle pushing through the thin fabric of your uniform shirt, a silent promise of instant, violent death if you dare to breathe wrong. Your heart hammers frantically against your ribs, cold sweat pooling at the collar of your neck as you freeze, knowing one wrong flinch will paint the bleak concrete floor with your brains. But what if the weapon held against you wasn't made of forged steel? What if the deadly threat paralyzing your every muscle didn't hold a single bullet, lacked a firing pin, and wasn't even made of metal? What if the instrument of your absolute terror was nothing more than a discarded piece of washboard wood carved in the dead of night and stained pitch black with a dime store tin of shoe polish? If you're listening to this late at night, sitting in the dark, and feeling those familiar chills creeping down your spine, do me a favor, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment down below telling me which part of this nightmare scenario scared you the most. Let's get into it. The year is 1934. The Great Depression has a suffocating chokehold on the throat of America. The streets are starving. The banks are foreclosing on broken dreams. And out of this Dust Bowl desperation rises a man who would become a phantom, a twisted folk hero to the desperate masses, and the ultimate boogeyman to the authorities. His name is John Dillinger. He wasn't just a bank robber. He was officially designated as Public Enemy Number 1. He and his ruthless crew had been tearing through the Midwest like a localized hurricane, leaving a bloody, chaotic trail of shattered bank vaults, humiliated local cops, and violent shootouts in their wake. Dillinger was incredibly smooth. He was terrifyingly fast, and he possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to slip right through the fingers of the law just when they thought they had him dead to rights. He treated bank robberies like high-stakes theater, vaulting over teller counters with a Tommy gun in his hands and a dark, confident smirk on his face. But the authorities were absolutely sick of the show. They were tired of the front-page headlines mocking their incompetence over their morning coffee. The feds and the local police departments were out for blood, and they finally got their luck far away from the Midwest snow under the scorching sun of Tucson, Arizona. The capture in Tucson wasn't a blaze of glory. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic takedown for a man of his extremely violent pedigree. But the prized asset was secured. Dillinger was heavily shackled, surrounded by a small army of nervous law enforcement officers, and extradited back to the icy grip of the Midwest. His ultimate destination was the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. This wasn't going to be a slap on the wrist. The chase was over. Dillinger was facing the music for the cold-blooded murder of East Chicago police officer William O'Malley during a botched, chaotic bank heist just months prior. The state prosecutors weren't looking to lock him away and throw away the key. They were looking to strap him to a heavy wooden chair, hook up the copper electrodes, and let thousands of volts of electricity fry his brain until he was dead. Death row was waiting, looming over him like a dark shadow. The bitter air in Crown Point was incredibly thick with the morbid, breathless anticipation of a high-profile execution. The state desperately wanted to make a violent example out of him, to broadcast a message to every two-bit stick-up kid in America that no one, not even Public Enemy Number 1, outruns the law forever. When Dillinger stepped out of the transport plane, chained up like a rabid animal, the authorities felt an overwhelming, intoxicating sense of victory. They had caged the monster, and what a cage it was. The Crown Point Jail wasn't your run-of-the-mill, small-town county lockup. It was a modern marvel of penal engineering, a massive, imposing brick and steel monolith that local politicians and law enforcement proudly boasted was completely, undeniably escape-proof. It was mathematically designed to break the spirit of any man unfortunate enough to step foot inside its bleak, echoey corridors. The outer walls were impossibly thick, constructed of reinforced concrete that seemed to absorb all the light and all the hope from the cells. The cell block doors were heavy, solid steel gratings controlled by complex, interlocking mechanical levers. To get from the maximum security cell block to the outside world, a prisoner facing impossible odds would have to somehow bypass heavily armed guards, navigate a confusing labyrinth of locked gates, and make it past the warden's main office. which effectively doubled as a veritable armory of high-powered military-grade weaponry. Sheriff Lillian Holly, a formidable woman who had taken over the shiny badge after her husband was tragically killed in the line of duty, staked her entire professional reputation on this fortress. She stood before the blinding, flashing bulbs of the press cameras, and confidently declared to the entire nation that John Dillinger was going nowhere. And on paper, looking at the blueprints, she was absolutely right. To ensure the prize prisoner stayed put until his execution, the security measures were cranked up to levels bordering on sheer paranoia. It was a total, suffocating lockdown. The outer perimeter of the jail bristled with heavily armed National Guardsmen, their loaded rifles slung over their cold shoulders as they patrolled the freezing, snow-covered Indiana nights. Inside, a specially hand-picked detail of extra guards was stationed directly in the cell block, working around the clock in agonizingly long shifts. These men were armed to the teeth, their holstered, loaded weapons serving as a constant visual reminder to the inmates that a single misstep, a single wrong twitch, meant a bullet straight to the chest. The atmosphere inside Crown Point was a claustrophobic nightmare. It was an unending loop of clanking iron, harsh, unblinking electric lights that burned the eyes, and the heavy, metallic stench of fear, stale sweat, and unwashed bodies. For a man like John Dillinger, a man who thrived on the open roads, fast cars, and the pure, unadulterated adrenaline rush of total freedom, this was a living, breathing hell. It was the absolute end of the line. The guards confidently walked the tiers with their chests puffed out, their heavy leather boots echoing sharply on the concrete, secure in the absolute knowledge that they held the leash of the most dangerous dog in America. They looked at Dillinger, locked securely behind thick iron bars meant to hold a silverback gorilla, and they saw a dead man walking. They saw a defeated, broken criminal just killing time, waiting for his final date with the executioner. They felt completely, utterly safe, but that overwhelming sense of security, that blind, arrogant faith in their steel bars and concrete walls, was exactly the fatal weakness the monster in the cage was counting on. In a state-of-the-art fortress explicitly designed to keep physical threats contained, the heavily armed authorities completely forgot to guard against the one weapon that absolutely cannot be locked down: a desperate. When John Dillinger touched down in Indiana, the scene waiting for him at the Lake County Jail wasn't your standard grim perp walk. It was a full-blown chaotic media circus. The courtyard was absolutely swarming with aggressive reporters, hungry photographers, and morbidly curious onlookers pressing hard against the barricades just to get a fleeting glimpse of the devil himself. Flashbulbs exploded in rapid, blinding succession, turning the freezing winter morning into a strobe-lit theater of the absurd. The air was thick and heavy with the acrid scent of flash powder, exhaust fumes, and cheap cigar smoke. You would think a man staring down the barrel of a capital murder charge, a guy with a one-way ticket to the electric chair, would look shattered. You'd expect his eyes to be hollow, his posture slumped under the crushing, inevitable weight of his impending doom. But not Dillinger. He strutted through the heavy steel doors of the escape-proof fortress, looking less like a condemned inmate and more like a Hollywood leading man. Arriving at a red carpet movie premiere, he was impeccably dressed, his hair slicked back perfectly, flashing that trademark, wolfish grin that had made front-page headlines across the entire country. He treated the heavily armed officers surrounding him not as his captors, but as his own personal security detail. It was deeply, viscerally unsettling. He was entirely too calm for a man whose days were supposedly numbered. The sheer audacity of Dillinger's demeanor reached its absolute peak in a moment captured on film, a single, haunting photograph that would soon become the ultimate humiliating symbol of law enforcement arrogance. In the warden's office, amidst the chaotic, deafening buzz of the press, the authorities decided they needed a trophy shot. They desperately wanted to show the anxious public that the big, bad wolf was finally on a tight leash, totally neutralized. Standing in the center of the frame was prosecutor Robert Estill, the very man whose sole, defining professional mission was to legally murder John Dillinger. Beside him stood Sheriff Lillian Holly, looking stern and accomplished. And right there, sandwiched between the very people orchestrating his execution, was Dillinger. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't scowling or hiding his face from the lenses. Instead, he casually leaned over, draped his right arm comfortably across the prosecutor's shoulder, and flashed a brilliant, totally relaxed smile right into the camera. It looked like a cheerful reunion of old college buddies, not a high-stakes photo op with public enemy number one. The cops in the room chuckled, totally blind to the agonizing irony of the situation. They thought they were putting him in his place, parading their prized catch for the morning papers to secure their own political futures. They didn't realize that in that exact moment, Dillinger was the one pulling the strings. He was mocking them right to their faces, and they were far too drunk on their own victory to even notice the disrespect. But that famous arrogant smile was nothing more than a brilliant, highly calculated tactical smokescreen. While the press was busy scribbling down his witty one-liners and the local politicians were busy patting themselves on the back for a job well done, Dillinger's mind was running 100 miles an hour. He wasn't just soaking in the limelight. He was actively, ruthlessly hunting for a way out. Beneath the charismatic, easygoing facade, his dark eyes were cold, razor-sharp, and obsessively observant. Every single time a guard walked past his cell, Dillinger wasn't just looking at the man. He was looking at the man's duty belt. He was meticulously noting exactly where the heavy iron keys hung, tracking the metallic jingle to memorize which specific key opened which specific lock. When he was escorted down the bleak, echoey corridors for interrogations or meetings, he was silently counting his steps, mapping the intricate, confusing layout of the cell block in his head. He analyzed the heavy steel grated doors, noting the dangerous blind spots where the harsh overhead lights failed to reach. He memorized the shift changes, the guard rotations, and the exact moments when the heavy, suffocating tension in the cell block naturally dipped into a lull. While the authorities were busy admiring the impenetrable concrete walls and steel bars of their mighty fortress, Dillinger was mentally tearing those walls down, brick by brick. He was an apex predator locked in a cage, quietly, methodically studying the zookeepers. The real tragedy of Crown Point wasn't a lack of funding or a lack of security hardware. It was an overwhelming, fatal surplus of ego. The men guarding Dillinger fell hard for the most dangerous silent killer in law enforcement history: complacency. Because the jail was famously billed across the nation as completely escape-proof, the guards implicitly trusted the architecture over their own gut instincts. They looked at the thick iron bars. They looked at the sheer volume of armed men patrolling the frozen perimeter, and they subconsciously let their guard down. They believed the physical restraints did the heavy lifting for them. They slowly started to see Dillinger not as a lethal, highly unpredictable threat, but as a caged novelty, a tourist attraction behind bars. The strict by-the-book protocols began to subtly slip. The high-wire tension that should have been wrapped around the cell block softened into a dull, comfortable routine. The guards thought they held all the power simply because they held the guns and the keys. But in the dark, twisted world of true crime, power doesn't always come from the barrel of a loaded weapon. More often than not, it comes from the devastating element of absolute surprise. The authorities at Crown Point completely forgot the golden rule of maximum security. You can lock down a man's body. You can chain his wrists to his waist and strip him of his weapons, but you can never ever lock down a desperate man's mind. Dillinger saw right through their arrogance. He smelled their lazy confidence like blood in the water. Life inside the maximum security tier at Crown Point quickly settled into a dull, monotonous rhythm. The initial, high-voltage thrill of housing public enemy number one faded into the dreary, soul-crushing routine of jailhouse existence. For the guards, the days blurred together into a series of head counts, meal deliveries, and long, agonizingly boring stretches of pacing the concrete floor. The suffocating fear that Dillinger's gang might launch a full-scale, heavily armed military assault to break him out, a very real threat that had initially kept the guards on high alert, slowly began to dissipate. The brutal, freezing Indiana winter raged outside, effectively locking down the town. Nothing was happening. The high-profile prisoner was quiet, remarkably compliant, and spent most of his waking hours seemingly resigned to his grim fate. The guards, lulled by the thick steel bars and their own overwhelming numbers, began to relax. That fatal, insidious disease of complacency seeped deeply into the very foundation of the jail. They stopped looking at Dillinger as a lethal threat and started treating him just like any other inmate rotting away in the county lockup. They had completely forgotten the cardinal rule of guarding a predator. The moment you think they are tamed is the exact moment they strike. But while the guards were sleepwalking through their shifts, Dillinger was wide awake, his brilliant criminal mind operating in terrifying overdrive. He knew he couldn't physically overpower his captors, and he knew he couldn't dig his way through a foot of reinforced concrete. He needed a weapon, but in a highly secure lockup where every cell is strictly tossed and every inmate is heavily monitored, finding a piece of smuggled steel or a loaded firearm was absolutely impossible. So Dillinger decided that if he couldn't find a weapon, he was going to build one right under their noses, using the absolute trash they left lying around. He needed something raw, something overlooked, and he found it in the most mundane, pathetic object imaginable, a piece of a wooden washboard, or as some historical accounts suggest, a small, discarded wooden shelf from the cell block. It didn't matter what it originally was. To Dillinger, it was raw material. It was salvation disguised as garbage. The real magic, the true agonizing suspense of this escape, didn't happen in a massive, chaotic shootout. It happened in the dead, suffocating silence of the night. Dillinger somehow managed to secure a single, sharp razor blade, a highly contraband item likely slipped to him during a shave, overlooked by a careless guard, or traded in the jail's underground economy. That tiny, brittle piece of sharpened steel became his most critical tool. When the lights in the tier clicked off and the harsh, metallic sounds of the day died down, the cell block was plunged into a heavy, oppressive darkness. The only sounds were the hollow, echoing coughs of sick inmates, the deep, rhythmic snoring of the men sleeping in the adjacent cells, and the heavy, deliberate footsteps of the night guards walking their slow, repetitive patrols. This was Dillinger's time. Under the suffocating cover of a scratchy wool blanket, he went to work. He held the rough piece of wood tightly in his hand and began to shave off microscopic slivers with the razor blade. It was incredibly slow, agonizingly precise work. Every single scrape of the blade against the dry wood sounded like a gunshot to his own ears. If a guard heard that faint, rhythmic scratching, if a flashlight beam swept through his bars at the wrong second and caught him hunched over, it was instantly game over. The hole in the cell, solitary confinement, and a vastly accelerated date with the electric chair. The tension during those long, freezing nights was absolute murder. Dillinger had to hyper-focus on his task while simultaneously keeping one ear trained constantly on the hallway. He would carve a sliver, stop, and hold his breath. He listened for the heavy squeak of the guard's leather boots, the metallic clink of the heavy key rings swinging against a hip. When the footsteps approached, he would instantly freeze, hiding the wood and the razor blade under his mattress, faking deep sleep as the harsh yellow beam of the flashlight swept across his face. The second the heavy footsteps faded down the corridor, he pulled the wood back out and resumed carving. He wasn't just shaping a piece of wood. He was desperately sculpting his own life. Slowly, night after agonizing night, the rough block began to transform. He carved out the distinct, sloping grip. He meticulously shaped the short, blunt barrel. He even carved out a fake trigger guard. He was working entirely from memory, recreating the exact terrifying dimensions of a Colt .38 caliber revolver, the standard issue sidearm of the men guarding him. But a wooden carving, no matter how precise, still looks exactly like what it is. A piece of light-colored wood. It wouldn't fool anyone, especially under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the jailhouse lights. Dillinger needed to complete the illusion. He needed the final, deadly touch. The solution was as brilliant as it was simple. He reached out to a fellow inmate. Some say it was an African-American trustee who had access to basic supplies and managed to quietly borrow a small, cheap tin of black shoe polish. In the dim, shadowy light of his cell, Dillinger used an old rag to deeply work the dark, greasy polish into the grain of the carved wood. He rubbed it relentlessly, layer after layer, until the pale wood completely vanished. The polish dried to a dull, flat black, mimicking the sinister, non-reflective finish of gunmetal. He buffed it until it possessed a subtle, dangerous sheen. When he finally held the finished product up in the low light of his cell, the transformation was absolutely chilling. It didn't look like a toy. It didn't look like a piece of a washboard. It looked like a heavy, fully loaded, lethal weapon. It held the dark, undeniable promise of sudden death. The morning of Saturday, March 3, 1934, broke over Crown Point with a bitter, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep right through the thick, reinforced concrete walls of the jail. Inside the maximum security tier, the heavy atmosphere was thick with the distinct, metallic stench of institutional soap, stale sweat, and the damp chill of a Midwest winter. It was wash-up time, a strictly regimented, painfully dull routine, where the inmates were briefly allowed out of their individual cages to use the communal sinks and stretch their legs under. The heavy, unblinking surveillance of the armed guards, the harsh yellow electric bulbs buzzed relentlessly overhead, casting long, stark shadows across the cold tile floor. For the guards, this was just another monotonous Saturday morning shift, another tedious hour to burn before their relief arrived. They were tired, they were bored, and their guard was fatally, disastrously down. They had absolutely no idea that in just a few agonizing seconds, their heavily fortified, escape-proof reality was going to completely shatter. Enter Sam Cahoon. Cahoon was a veteran jailer, a seasoned, tough-as-nails guard who had walked these bleak, echoey corridors 1,000 times. He knew the inmates, he knew the routine, and he possessed that deep, unshakable confidence of a man completely secure in his total authority. As the inmates milled about in the open tier area, Cahoon slowly made his rounds, his heavy leather boots scuffing rhythmically against the concrete, the large ring of heavy iron keys jingling loudly at his hip. It was a sound that commanded absolute obedience. He approached the area where John Dillinger was quietly standing. Dillinger looked completely unremarkable, just another gray-clad inmate going through the motion of the morning wash-up. His face was a blank, unreadable mask, giving away absolutely nothing of the violent storm raging violently inside his head. The suspense in the air was thick enough to choke on. This was the absolute, heart-pounding peak of the gamble. Dillinger's hand was shoved deep inside his pocket, his fingers tightly, desperately gripping the smooth, shoe-polish-stained wood of his carved fake gun. His knuckles were white. If Cahoon looked at him too closely, if a fellow guard walking the upper catwalk happened to glance down at the wrong microsecond, or if the wooden prop somehow caught the harsh light and exposed its fake dull grain, Dillinger would be shot dead on the spot. He was standing on a razor's edge, balancing perfectly between sudden, violent death and total freedom. He waited until Cahoon was right next to him, close enough to smell the stale coffee on the guard's breath. He waited for the exact moment when the veteran guard's attention casually drifted away. In a lightning-fast, terrifyingly fluid motion, Dillinger completely dropped his docile inmate persona. He whipped his hand out of his pocket and viciously jammed the hard, blunt muzzle of the carved black wood directly into Sam Cahoon's ribs. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was a violent, forceful thrust designed to mimic the heavy, cold steel of a loaded revolver. At the exact same moment, Dillinger leaned in incredibly close, his face practically pressed against Cahoon's ear, and hissed in a voice so cold, so utterly devoid of humanity. It would freeze the blood in your veins. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He spoke with the terrifying, absolute certainty of an apex predator closing its jaws. He told Cahoon very simply and very quietly that if he made a single sound, if he even dared to twitch a muscle toward the alarm, he would pull the trigger and blow his goddamn spine right out the front of his chest. The psychological impact on Sam Cahoon was immediate and absolutely devastating. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated terror of that exact moment. You are standing in the middle of a heavily armed fortress, completely secure in your power, and in the blink of an eye, the most notoriously violent, ruthless killer in America has a gun jammed hard into your side. Under the weak, shadowy light of the jail corridor and fueled by the massive, adrenaline-spiking surge of panic, Cahoon didn't see a carved piece of washboard wood. His terrified brain completely short-circuited the rational thought process. All he felt was the agonizing, sharp pressure in his ribs. All he saw out of his peripheral vision was the dull, black shape of a weapon. All he heard was the chilling, absolute promise of a violent death whispered directly into his ear. He was instantly paralyzed by a cold, suffocating dread. The heavy iron keys at his hip suddenly felt incredibly useless. This is the ultimate what-if moment that still haunts the FBI and true crime historians to this very day. What if Sam Cahoon had possessed a split-second flash of incredible bravery or perhaps foolishness? What if he had aggressively twisted his body, risking a bullet to grab the weapon? If he had, his hands would have met cheap, painted wood instead of cold steel. The entire bluff would have instantly collapsed. The alarms would have blared. The other guards would have drawn their heavy weapons. And John Dillinger would have been violently gunned down on that cold concrete floor. A pathetic end to his criminal empire. The legend would have died right there. But fear is an incredibly powerful, paralyzing drug. It completely hijacked Cahoon's central nervous system. He didn't fight back. He didn't scream. He slowly, terrifyingly raised his hands, completely surrendering his absolute authority to a man armed with nothing more than a toy and a terrifying reputation. The dominoes were now perfectly lined up, and Dillinger had just confidently pushed the first one over. The escape-proof fortress, the terrifying brilliance of John Dillinger's escape wasn't just in the creation of the fake gun. It was in the incredibly cold-blooded, methodical way he weaponized it. The moment veteran guard Sam Cahoon froze, his hands trembling in the air, the entire power dynamic of the Crown Point jail completely inverted. Dillinger didn't panic. He didn't make a mad, chaotic dash for the nearest exit, which would have instantly exposed his back to the heavily armed guards stationed throughout the building. That would have been suicide. Instead, he maintained absolute chilling control. He kept the blackened muzzle of his carved wood pressed hard into Cahoon's side and used the terrified jailer as a highly effective human shield. He was operating with the terrifying, precise calm of a surgeon. Dillinger leaned in and quietly commanded Cahoon to summon the next guard. He didn't want a loud, panic-inducing shout. He demanded a normal, casual call, the kind that wouldn't raise any suspicion in the incredibly tense atmosphere of the jail. Cahoon, his voice shaking terribly, his eyes wide with unadulterated fear, called out to a fellow guard down the hall. The second guard, completely oblivious to the silent, deadly hostage situation unfolding just a few yards away, casually strolled into the tier. The moment he crossed the threshold, the trap brutally snapped shut. Dillinger smoothly pivoted, keeping Cahoon pinned, and leveled the fake gun directly at the newcomer's face. The harsh overhead lights caught the dull, shoe-polish sheen of the carved wood. To the second guard, staring down the barrel of what he absolutely believed was a loaded .38 caliber revolver held by the most dangerous man in America. It was a paralyzing, terrifying sight. He, too, instantly threw his hands up in total surrender. What followed was one of the most agonizing, slow-motion, and deeply humiliating systematic takedowns in the history of American law enforcement. It was an incredibly tense, high-stakes game of psychological dominoes. Dillinger ordered the two captive guards into an empty cell and locked the heavy steel grate behind them. The loud, metallic clack of the lock echoed down the corridor, the unmistakable sound of authority being locked inside its own cage. But he was far from finished. The cell block was still crawling with heavily armed men, and the slightest misstep would bring the entire fortress crashing down on his head. With terrifying audacity, Dillinger repeated the exact same process. He used the growing, chaotic confusion and the absolute silence of his captives to lure in more guards. He ambushed them one by one, or sometimes in small groups of two, as they stumbled into his deadly trap. Each time, the scenario played out exactly the same. A guard would walk around the corner expecting routine, find themselves staring directly into the dead, cold eyes of John Dillinger and the blackened barrel of his weapon, and immediately surrender. They were stripped of their keys, utterly humiliated, and marched silently into the growing collection of locked cells. The tension during this process was absolutely unbearable. The air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. If a guard standing at the far end of the hallway, out of Dillinger's immediate reach, noticed the suspicious gathering and simply unholstered his weapon, The jig was completely up. If a guard hesitated, if one of them decided to be a hero and call Dillinger's bluff, the fake gun would be exposed, and a massive bloody shootout would instantly erupt. But no one called his bluff. The sheer, terrifying weight of Dillinger's reputation did all the heavy lifting. The guards didn't see a wooden toy. They saw public enemy number one, a ruthless cop killer who wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. They were completely paralyzed by the overwhelming psychological fear he projected. He was herding heavily armed men like terrified sheep into an iron pen. He didn't just lock up the guards either. To ensure absolute silence and total control over his environment, he also started locking up the other inmates who were unfortunate enough to be out in the open tier. He forced everyone, cops and criminals alike, into the cages. By the time he was done meticulously sweeping the cell block, Dillinger had systematically corralled and locked up roughly 33 people. 33 men, including a massive contingent of heavily armed, highly trained security personnel specifically assigned to guard him, were sitting helplessly behind steel bars, and the man holding the keys, the man who had single-handedly conquered the escape-proof fortress of Crown Point. He hadn't fired a single shot. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He had completely dismantled the entire security apparatus of a maximum security jail using nothing more than pure, unadulterated psychological terror and a piece of garbage he found in a corner. It was a masterclass in manipulation. But he was still inside the building. The hardest part was yet to come. Even with 33 terrified men locked securely behind cold iron bars, John Dillinger was still fundamentally a rat trapped in a highly sophisticated maze. He had completely conquered the cell block, but the sprawling, heavily guarded labyrinth of the Crown Point jail still stood between him and the freezing Indiana air. He was completely alone, armed only with a carved piece of washboard and a bluff that was dangerously close to its expiration date. He needed muscle. He needed a terrifying physical presence to back up his psychological dominance. He needed an accomplice who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He found precisely what he was looking for in Herbert Youngblood. Youngblood was a towering, heavily built African-American inmate, a man whose physical stature alone commanded immediate, fearful respect. He wasn't some petty thief. He was sitting in Crown Point staring down the barrel of a very serious, very fatal murder charge. He was looking at the exact same grim, terrifying future as Dillinger, a slow walk to the electric chair. When Dillinger approached Youngblood's cell and unlocked the heavy steel grate, he wasn't just offering him a way out. He was offering him a chaotic, violent second chance at life. The alliance they struck in that dark, tense corridor was a terrifying marriage of convenience. Dillinger provided the absolute, cold-blooded tactical brilliance, the sheer, audacious nerve, and the master plan. Youngblood provided the sheer, intimidating physical mass, the necessary, violent muscle to clear any remaining physical obstacles. Together, they formed an incredibly lethal, highly desperate team. The two men moved quickly and silently through the echoey, dimly lit corridors. The heavy tension in the air was absolute murder. Every corner they turned could hide a heavily armed guard, completely unaware of the massive breach that had just occurred in the cell block. Every heavy footstep had to be calculated. Dillinger's ultimate, terrifying goal wasn't just the exit doors. It was the nerve center of the entire facility. The warden's main office, which effectively doubled as the jail's heavily fortified armory. It was the only place where he could finally trade his desperate, painted wooden bluff for cold, hard, terrifying reality. When they violently breached the armory doors, the scene was pure, unadulterated chaos. Dillinger and Youngblood stormed in, catching the remaining, unsuspecting staff completely off guard. Dillinger shoved the blackened wooden gun into the faces of the terrified clerks and remaining guards, his voice cracking with the sheer, adrenaline-fueled intensity of the moment. Youngblood aggressively manhandled anyone who hesitated, physically dominating the room. The absolute shock and sheer terror on the faces of the staff allowed the two desperate inmates to seize complete control of the room in mere seconds. And then came the ultimate, chilling turning point. The exact moment the massive, terrifying illusion finally ended, Dillinger violently yanked open the heavy metal weapons locker. His eyes locked onto the prize he had been desperately dreaming of. He reached in and pulled out two heavy, fully loaded, military-grade Thompson submachine guns, the legendary, devastating Tommy guns. The cold, heavy steel of the real weapons in his hands fundamentally changed the entire atmosphere of the room. The power dynamic didn't just shift. It violently slammed into a completely new, terrifying reality. With a genuine, high-powered, fully automatic weapon securely in his grip, Dillinger no longer needed the prop. The terrifying charade was officially over. In a moment of supreme, arrogant theatricality that cemented his dark legend, he held up the carved, shoe-polish-stained piece of wood for all the terrified, captive officers to clearly see. He laughed, a cold, mocking, utterly triumphant sound that echoed off the concrete walls. According to historical accounts, he reportedly gloated, showing them exactly what had defeated their impenetrable fortress. The sheer, devastating realization that washed over the faces of the captured lawmen was agonizing. The deep, burning humiliation was worse than any physical wound. They hadn't been overpowered by a heavily armed gang. They hadn't been outgunned in a blazing shootout. They, the guardians of the escape-proof Crown Point jail, had completely surrendered their weapons, their freedom, and their absolute pride to a man wielding a piece of painted trash. The psychological devastation was absolute, but Dillinger didn't have time to gloat for long. He had the guns, he had the muscle, but he still needed wheels to complete the ultimate humiliating getaway. The heavily armed, terrifying reality of the Thompson submachine gun in John Dillinger's hands radically changed the stakes. He was no longer relying on a desperate bluff. He was holding a weapon capable of shredding the concrete walls of Crown Point and anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. But he couldn't just casually stroll out the front door into the freezing, heavily patrolled streets of Indiana. He needed a hostage to ensure his safe passage, and more importantly, he desperately needed a fast, reliable set of wheels. The escape was only half the battle. The true test was the getaway. He didn't grab just anyone. Dillinger, ever the calculating predator, selected two highly strategic hostages: Deputy Sheriff Ernest Blunk, a man whose uniform would serve as a powerful visual shield, and Edwin Sager, the jail's resident mechanic. Sager was the key. He knew the vehicles, he knew the garage, and he knew exactly how to get them out quietly. Dillinger forcefully shoved the heavy barrel of the Tommy gun into Blunk's back, the cold steel digging painfully through his shirt. It was no longer a piece of wood. The threat of instant, violent death was now terrifyingly real. With young blood closely flanking them, gripping his own heavily loaded weapon, the tense, agonizingly slow procession moved toward the jail's rear exit, heading straight for the attached garage. The garage was cold, dimly lit, and smelled heavily of motor oil and exhaust. It was here that Dillinger committed the absolute, ultimate act of mocking defiance, an insult so deeply humiliating it would completely destroy careers and embarrass the American justice system on a national scale. He didn't just demand any random police cruiser or a slow, heavily marked transport van. He meticulously scanned the rows of parked vehicles and pointed his weapon directly at a sleek, brand-new, incredibly fast Ford V8. It wasn't just any V8. It was the personal, highly prized vehicle of Sheriff Lillian Hawley herself, the very woman who had proudly stood before the blinding flashbulbs of the national press, aggressively boasting to the entire country that her massive, escape-proof fortress would hold the devil himself, was about to have her own car stolen by him. The tension in the freezing garage was incredibly thick. The heavy, metallic clank of the garage doors, slowly rolling up, echoed loudly, sounding like a massive alarm bell to the terrified hostages. Every second they spent in that exposed area felt like an agonizing eternity. If a heavily armed National Guardsman patrolling the frozen outer perimeter happened to glance over, or if a local cop driving by noticed the suspicious activity, the heavy silence would instantly shatter into a chaotic, bloody firefight. Dillinger shoved Deputy Blunk behind the steering wheel and violently ordered Sager into the back seat alongside Youngblood. Dillinger himself slid smoothly into the passenger seat, resting the heavy, loaded Tommy gun casually across his lap, the barrel pointing menacingly at Blunk. "Drive," Dillinger commanded, his voice cold, flat, and completely devoid of panic. The powerful engine of the Ford V8 roared to life, a deep, throaty rumble that seemed incredibly loud in the tense silence of the morning. Blunk, his hands sweating profusely and trembling violently on the leather steering wheel, slowly eased the car out of the garage. And then the absolute, unbelievable climax of the escape unfolded. As the sleek, dark car rolled out onto the freezing, snow-covered streets of Crown Point, there were no blaring, chaotic sirens. There were no bright, flashing red lights. There was absolutely no sound of heavy gunfire shattering the cold morning air. Dillinger, the most heavily hunted, incredibly dangerous man in America, simply sat back in the comfortable passenger seat of the sheriff's personal car and calmly watched the massive, imposing brick walls of the escape-proof jail slowly fade away in the rearview mirror. He watched the heavily armed guards, still freezing on their perimeter patrols, completely oblivious to the fact that their prized prisoner had just casually slipped right through their heavily fortified fingers. The sheer, overwhelming audacity of the moment was breathtaking. He hadn't just broken out of a maximum security prison. He had taken a leisurely morning joyride right out of hell, and he had used the warden's own personal vehicle to do it. The perfect, humiliating crime was complete. But in his arrogant, intoxicating moment of total triumph, Dillinger was about to make a massive, absolutely fatal miscalculation that would ultimately seal his violent doom. The atmosphere inside Sheriff Hawley's stolen Ford V8 was bizarrely, terrifyingly relaxed. As they sped away from the bleak, oppressive shadow of Crown Point, John Dillinger wasn't acting like a desperate fugitive fleeing for his life. He was acting like a man on a Sunday drive. He casually hummed a tune, meticulously wiped down the cold steel of his stolen Thompson submachine gun, and even engaged his terrified hostages in light, mocking conversation. He was incredibly high on the intoxicating adrenaline of his own dark brilliance. When they reached a desolate stretch of road miles away from the massive manhunt that was undoubtedly exploding behind them, Dillinger finally ordered Deputy Blunk to pull over. He didn't execute his hostages. In a final, incredibly arrogant display of his twisted gentleman bandit persona, he let Blunk and Sager out of the car completely unharmed. He even tossed them a few crumpled dollar bills, mockingly telling them to catch a train back to their humiliated colleagues. As he drove off, leaving the freezing lawmen stranded on the side of the road, Dillinger genuinely believed he had pulled off the perfect, impossible crime. Back at Crown Point, the scene was an absolute, unmitigated disaster of catastrophic proportions. When the trapped, deeply humiliated guards were finally discovered, and the alarm violently shattered the morning silence, the entire facility descended into pure, unadulterated chaos. Sheriff Lillian Hawley, the woman who had proudly staked her entire career on the impenetrable fortress, completely broke down. The national media, the same aggressive reporters who had gleefully snapped Dillinger's arrogant, smiling photo just weeks prior, completely turned on the authorities. The headlines were incredibly vicious, mercilessly mocking the sheer, staggering incompetence of the Indiana law enforcement system. The American justice system hadn't just been beaten. Its face had been violently shoved into the dirt and publicly humiliated by a man with a carved piece of trash and a tin of cheap shoe polish. But amidst the chaotic, screaming headlines and the deeply embarrassed press conferences, Dillinger made one massive, incredibly stupid, and absolutely fatal tactical error. He was driving a stolen car, but more importantly, in his desperate rush to put as much distance as possible between himself and the burning wreckage of his escape, he drove that stolen Ford V8 across the state line, crossing from Indiana straight into Illinois. He was heading for the dark, comforting criminal underworld of Chicago, a place where he felt completely safe. That single, simple act, driving a stolen vehicle across a state border, was the fatal flaw that doomed him. The local authorities in Indiana couldn't cross state lines to hunt him, but by crossing that invisible boundary in a stolen car, Dillinger violently triggered the Dyer Act, a highly specific federal law known officially as the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act. Instantly, his brilliant, humiliating local jailbreak was violently escalated into a major federal crime. The incredibly powerful, relentlessly aggressive machinery of the United States government was now officially involved. J. Edgar Hoover, the fiercely ambitious and deeply embarrassed director of the FBI, saw his perfect golden opportunity. He had been desperately waiting for a solid, undeniable reason to completely take over the Dillinger case. The local cops had completely fumbled the ball, and Hoover was aggressively determined to show the nation the terrifying power of his new, highly modernized federal agency. The feds didn't mess around with local politics or state jurisdictions. They had massive resources, incredibly wide-reaching authority, and they were hunting with an absolute deadly purpose. The massive, chaotic, nationwide manhunt was immediately shifted into absolute overdrive. Dillinger's incredibly brilliant, wildly successful escape from Crown Point, the wooden gun, the psychological terror, the humiliating joyride, was his ultimate crowning achievement, but it was also his death warrant. By incredibly arrogantly turning a local murder case into a massive federal manhunt, he forced the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world to make him their absolute top priority. He spent the next few months living like a hunted animal, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that the massive, suffocating weight of the federal government was closing in. The chase was frantic, brutal, and incredibly violent. And it all inevitably ended just a few short months later on a sweltering, incredibly humid July night in Chicago. Betrayed by a woman wearing a bright orange skirt, completely surrounded by heavily armed federal agents in a dark, narrow alleyway outside the Biograph Theater, John Dillinger never even had a chance to reach for his real gun. The feds didn't bother with a terrifying bluff. They didn't ask for a surrender. They simply opened fire, brutally gunning down public enemy number one in a massive, chaotic hail of real, unforgiving lead. The legend of the wooden gun died on the filthy, blood-soaked pavement of a Chicago alley. It's an incredibly chilling reminder that in the dark, twisted world of true crime, the most dangerous weapon a man can wield isn't forged from heavy steel or loaded with bullets. The most terrifying weapon is a desperate, cunning mind capable of manipulating human fear to bend reality itself. Dillinger proved that if you can conquer a man's mind, you don't even need a real gun to conquer his fortress. If you're still listening to this late at night, sitting in the dark and feeling those deep chills down your spine, do me a huge favor. Smash that subscribe button, hit the like, and drop a comment telling me what you think was Dillinger's biggest mistake. Until next time, keep the lights on and stay safe out there.